On April 18, 1943, 4 young boys were playing in the forests of Hagley Wood near Wychbury Hill in Worcestershire, England. They were involved in an activity known as bird nesting, a popular pastime among the youth of the era, where boys would climb the trees in which birds had made their nests, stealing their eggs to amass a collection of uniquely blue and speckled specimens. At some point in their foray into the woods, the boys came across a particularly large wych elm, a favorite for birds to make their nests in. One of the young men, a boy named Robert Farmer, was by far the strongest climber among them, and so it was he that scaled the trunk before shimmying among the branches in search of nests to poach. Once he had done so, he discovered that the tree's trunk was actually hollow and extended down many feet. Curious, he peered into the hollow and was greeted by a sight that chilled him to the bone. It was a human skull, complete with human hair and teeth. Robert almost fell out of the tree when he realized what he was looking at, but he was left in a dire predicament indeed, for Hagley Wood was part of the Hagley estate and the land belonged to Lord Cobham, and the boys were trespassing on his property. If they told anyone what they'd seen, their parents would find out where they'd been, and that might well be way more trouble than what it was worth. And so the boys quickly departed Hagley Wood, pale-faced and shaken, running home to their parents before they began to wonder where they'd gotten to. But that night, one of the boys named Thomas Willett found himself visited by vivid and terrifying nightmares. In them, he saw visions of the woman trapped inside the wych elm, still alive and wailing as the tree grew up around her, holding her in place like some horrible wooden prison. She screamed for him to help, but as much as he tried to, he couldn't, and when he tried to call for help, his voice caught in his throat, and he was rendered silent. Thomas cried out as he awoke from his nightmare, and when his parents arrived in his bedroom to see what had upset him so, he confessed everything. He told them of Hagley Wood, of poaching bird eggs, but most importantly, he told them of the skeleton trapped inside the wych elm. First thing the next morning, Thomas's parents walked down to the local police station to tell them of their son's discovery. Constables ventured out to the wych elm the boys had described, checking the hollow trunk more thoroughly, and found an almost complete skeleton concealed in it. They also found the woman's golden wedding band, as well as some fragments of clothing that were believed to belong to the deceased. The skull itself was seen as valuable evidence, as just as young Robert Farmer had seen, it still had a fairly complete dental pattern as well as a few tufts of hair that had fallen away from the scalp. The responding constables then combed the area for additional clues as to who or why the woman's body had been interred inside the hollow, and it was as a result of this search that they found the remains of a human hand hidden among the dirt and leaves not too far from the tree itself. It didn't take long for the police to determine that someone had severed the woman's hand before she had been tossed inside of the hollow trunk. A subsequent forensic examination quickly established that the woman had been buried inside the wych elm and had been dead for no longer than a year and a half, making the date of her murder around October of 1941. The examining coroner also discovered a piece of taffeta in her mouth, which suggested that asphyxiation may well have been the cause of the death. Taffeta is a crisp and smooth variety of woven fabric made from silk and polyester. It is considered to be a very high-end kind of fabric, suitable for use in ball gowns and wedding dresses, given that it holds its shape better than many other fabrics. So we can reasonably believe that whoever murdered the woman was either a dressmaker or wealthy enough to be able to afford such expensive fabrics. Also, based on the measurements of the wych elm's trunk, the coroner deduced that she was almost certainly placed inside the hollow when she had been freshly killed, as there was no way that she would have fit inside once rigor mortis had set in. Using the various items found alongside the body, police could make an accurate guess of what the woman might have looked like. However, with the Second World War being in full swing at the time of her death and discovery, there were legions of civilians reported missing due to German bomb raidings, and records were far too vast for them to make a proper identification. Details were cross-referenced with hundreds of missing person reports, but nothing seemed to line up. Additionally, dentists from all over the United Kingdom were contacted in the hopes of identifying the pattern of the woman's teeth, commonly known in dentistry circles as the bite, Yet still, none of their records matched the woman's distinctive tooth pattern, and still her identity remained unknown. Interest and curiosity in the strange case was rife among the general population, who were disturbed as they were intrigued by the ominous details surrounding the woman's murder. Their demands for answers seemed to peak a year later in 1944, when graffiti appeared on the Hagley obelisk not far from where her body was discovered. It read, "Who put Bella in the witch elm?" But in the years that followed, no definitive answers would surface regarding the murder, but this is unsurprising. The human and material resources' entire British state was stretched to breaking point in its quest to defeat the evils of Nazism across mainland Europe, and so the question of mysterious murder was most definitely not a top priority of national or local police forces. And so, almost 80 years later, we are still forced to ask ourselves, who did put that woman's dead body in the witch elm of Hagley Wood? There are many prevailing theories as to why the body was placed there, and to whom it belonged to. One possibility is that the body was that of a Birmingham prostitute who was only reported missing in 1944, having apparently disappeared 3 years earlier. The report stated that her name was Lubella, which leads us to the disturbing realization that whoever daubed the graffiti on the Hagley obelisk must have known of the victim's identity, or that of the murderer, long before she was ever properly identified. Another theory involves a patient of the Stafford Mental Hospital by the name of Jack Mossop. Mossop regularly complained to the hospital staff of reoccurring nightmares involving a woman staring out at him from a tree. Jack died long before the body was ever discovered, but 10 years after his death, at a time when the witch elm story was well entrenched in the public's consciousness, his wife came forward with information that he had been involved. The woman, Una Mossop, said her husband had once confessed that he and a friend had been drinking in the Littleton Arms, a public house located in Hagley, when they had found themselves being hectored by a particularly drunk woman who demanded they buy her a drink. The men had ended up giving her a lift home in their motor car when she had thrown up all over the back seat, and to teach her a lesson, they had hauled her drunken body into the woods and thrown her into the hollow of a tree, hoping it would frighten her into the seeing the error of her own ways. But unless they had outright murdered her or she had died of exposure while trapped inside the hollow trunk, there are no reasons to believe the ravings of a madman who had later been interned into a mental hospital. And if that was indeed the truth of the matter, why had they severed her hand before doing so? However, there was another theory put forward in 1945 by an anthropologist and archaeologist from University College London, named Margaret Murray. Professor Murray's suggestion is perhaps by far the most disturbing of all the possible theories regarding Bella's disappearance and death, and involves something that was long thought to be eradicated by the British Isles: witchcraft. Professor Murray stated that the fact that Bella's hand was severed makes the details of her murder consistent with an arcane ritual known as the Hand of Glory, which according to her could well have been performed by a group of local gypsies. According to old European folklore, a lit candle made of the fat from one who had died an unnatural death, then placed in their own severed hand as if in a candlestick, would serve as a powerful magical talisman. The Hand of Glory would render anyone to whom it was presented unable to move. This candle could be put out only with milk. The hair of the dead person was to be used as a wick, and the candle would give light only to whoever was holding it. Around the same time as her assertions surrounding the death and dismemberment of the mysterious Bella, Professor Murray linked the murder to the slaying of a man named Charles Walton, who was murdered in a similarly ritualistic fashion in the nearby area of Quinton. 75-year-old Charles Walton had been pruning hedges and undertaking other generally gardening work on Valentine's Day of 1945, when he had been set upon by a mysterious assailant. The murderer had been beaten by Dr. Walton over the head with his own walking stick, then cut his neck open with a slash hook and driven the prongs of Walton's own pitchfork into either side of his neck, pinning him to the ground. Mr. Walton's left hand had been severed, and despite many thorough searches of the area was never found. Detective Superintendent Robert Fabian of the Metropolitan Police was sent to investigate the grisly murder and wrote the following of his discoveries. I advise anybody who is tempted at any time to venture into black magic, witchcraft, shamanism, call it what you will, to remember Charles Walton and to think of his death, which was clearly the ghastly climax of a pagan rite. There is no stronger argument for keeping as far away as possible from the villains with their swords, incense, and mumbo-jumbo. It is prudent, on which your future peace of mind and even your life could depend. Fabian also claimed to have spoken to many Quinton residents who believed that Walton was a witch whose powers were feared by some villagers. It was claimed he would cast the evil eye and kept natterjack toads as pets, using them to blight the crops and livestock of local farmers. Just one example cited by locals was the failure of the 1944 harvest. It was claimed that this alleged witchcraft led him to be murdered in a ritualistic manner which involved his blood soaking in the garden to replenish the soil's fertility, and that his hand had been taken to perform a hand of glory ritual. Robert Fabian's investigation into the murder also led him to work with Detective Superintendent Alex Spooner, head of Warwickshire CID. It was Spooner who is said to have drawn Fabian's attention to a book entitled Folklore, Old Customs and Superstitions in Shakespearean Land, written by the Reverend James Harvey Bloom and published in 1929. The book included an apparently true story set in 1885 of how a young plowboy had been seen to summon a ghostly black dog on several consecutive nights, and how at one point the dog had been accompanied by a headless woman. Fabian was said to be disturbed beyond belief when he discovered that the name of this plowboy was none other than Charles Walton. Fabian was also in later years to suggest that he had been met with a wall of silence when he tried to get to the bottom of the murder, telling the press in 1945 that the natives of Upper and Lower Quinton and the surrounding district are of a secretive disposition and they do not take easily to strangers. Whether or not the two murders are actually connected is completely undecided, but the fact that two ritualistic murders were committed just a few years apart and so close to each other is something we absolutely cannot ignore. Since the 1970s, some have even suggested that Bella had been killed because of her involvement in a German spy ring, but each theory put forward had been subsequently disproved. The only one that has categorically not been ruled out is the one with occult connotations. The mysterious Bella may well have been murdered as part of an ancient pre-Christian ritual, just as Charles Walton had been. But one thing may never be decided upon is just exactly who severed her hand before putting her still warm body in that witch elm of Hagley Wood. There is a place in western Norway, near to the city of Bergen, known as Isdalen, or Ice Valley. But the place has another name too, Dødsdalen, or Death Valley. Death Valley earned its name from the huge number of steep, sheer cliffs which in another age were known among the hardy Nordic populace as Ættestupa. These were places where elderly members of society who were no longer capable of caring for themselves and thus considered a burden could commit a kind of ritual senocide. When it was decided it was their time, older folks would be assisted in climbing the peaks of the Ættestupa, where they would then throw themselves into the valley below for what was hoped to be a quick and painless death. But sometimes fear of the end would overwhelm them, and it was then that their accompaniment would give them the little push they needed to complete the ritual. It was here, in such a grim, foreboding landscape, that a Norwegian father decided to take his two daughters hiking in November of 1970. The trio were hiking along the popular trails of Ulriken, the highest of the 7 mountains that surrounded the city of Bergen, on their way to the restaurant that sits on the mountain's highest peak. Whilst on their way up, one of the man's daughters smelled a burning smell coming from nearby, but they were not nearly high enough for the smell to be from the restaurant, and the trio soon found themselves in search of the source of the scent. One of the girls bounded over a rise, and when she laid eyes on what was emanating such a horrid and acrid smell, she screamed. There, lying among a collection of broken rock fragments at the base of a craggy mountain cliff, lay the body of a woman, laying face up on her back, charred beyond all recognition. The trio rushed back into town, hurrying to inform the local police force of what they had located. The two young girls, thoroughly traumatized by what they'd seen, went home to their mothers to recover, while the father led police back to the place the woman's burned body lay. Soon an investigation was underway. Upon their inspection, the first thing the police noticed about the scene surrounding the woman's body were a number of items that seemed like they had been arranged in a very particular way. All had scorch marks on them, suggesting that they had been exposed to the same fire that had charred the woman's corpse. These included a few pieces of jewelry, a wristwatch, a woolen jumper and scarf, a pair of rubber boots, some nylon stockings, a purse, a plastic passport cover, 2 plastic water bottles, an umbrella, an empty bottle of cheap liquor, a matchbox, and some sleeping pills. Beneath the body was a fur that was found to have traces of gasoline on it. The police also noted that each of the items had been scrubbed of any personal identifiers. A few days later, 2 suitcases were found to be abandoned at Bergen railway station. When they were inspected, staff found what appeared to be a regular set of travelers' luggage. Inside were clothes, cosmetics, and a purse containing currency from a couple of different European countries. Only something was unusual about the items, as all the brand labels and personal identifiers had been either removed or scratched off. Also among the items was a notepad that contained what appeared to be a coded message. When this was reported to the local police, they determined that both suitcases must have belonged to the burned woman. Yet there was still the question of who she was, or why someone would wish to travel with such anonymity. An autopsy conducted at the nearby Auckland University Hospital found the mysterious woman had died from a combination of 2 things. Firstly, analysis of her blood and stomach showed that she had inhaled a fatal amount of carbon monoxide, as well as having consumed around 60 sleeping pills, well over the safe dosage for barbiturates. However, her lungs were found to contain a considerable amount of soot, meaning she had been still alive when she was placed in whatever fire had scorched her beyond recognition. She also had bruises around her neck, indicating that she had struck or had been gripped extremely hard, possibly to drag or push her into the fire. Since her identity was still unknown at that point, tissue samples were taken and her jaw was removed because of the uniquely patterned gold fillings that she had in her teeth. It was hoped that somewhere a dentist may have been able to recognize the work and thus piece together who she was. Since the Norwegian police were still not closer to discovering who the burned woman was, a national appeal was launched, urging members of the public to come forward if they had any information regarding the woman's movements or identity. Composite sketches, based on a forensic analysis of the woman's facial structure, were swiftly circulated via national newspapers and TV stations. It was then that staff members of the Hotel Hordeheimen, a local Bergen hotel, came forward having recognized the woman from the sketches. According to them, they saw the woman on November 23rd, having just checked out of room 407. They told police that she was an attractive 30 to 40-year-old, standing around 5'4", with dark brown hair and similarly colored eyes. She had claimed to be a traveling saleswoman, dealing in rare antiques and artifacts. They also noted that she appeared to be extremely nervous, keeping to her room and barely interacting with other guests or hotel staff. One member of staff in particular mentioned that she was almost certain that the one time she had seen the woman interacting with another guest, she did so speaking in German. They also noted that she only ever paid for things in cash, and at one point asked to change rooms, giving a spurious explanation as to why she needed to do so. Around the same time as these first few pieces of information were coming out, Norwegian homicide detectives were also having a breakthrough regarding the coded message in the woman's notepad. Cryptologists had come to the conclusion that the codes were a list of locations the woman had visited, along with the dates and times of her visits. Once these were cross-referenced with handwritten check and forms at various hotels, detectives were able to determine that the mystery woman had traveled extensively around Europe under a variety of fake names, using a series of forged documents, all the while claiming to be a Belgian citizen. Another set of hotel staff came forward not long after, but this time they claimed that the woman was blonde and spoke Flemish during her one rare interaction with another guest. After months of investigation and a huge amount of resources poured into the inquiry, All hope of identifying the woman was lost, and the case seemed to be destined to remain unsolved. Despite strong evidence to the contrary, authorities were forced to conclude that the burned woman had ended her own life, since she had ingested a huge quantity of sleeping pills. And so, on February 5, 1971, the mysterious burned woman was buried in an unmarked grave in Bergen's Molendal Cemetery. Only a handful of the Bergen police force were in attendance, and it appeared that all of her secrets would be buried with her. But since then, a number of theories and developments came to the fore, which may well shed more light on who exactly she was, and why she had to die in such a violent, untimely manner. Naturally, due to the highly suspicious circumstances surrounding the woman's death, it wasn't long before some people suspected a cover-up, instigated by the Norwegian National Criminal Investigation Service. Given that the incident occurred during the height of the Cold War, some believe that the woman was some kind of spy, and indeed the 9 fake passports found in her possession pointed to the involvement of a highly effective and professional organization. There is also the fact that the woman's murder could be linked to a number of other mysterious disturbances that had taken place in 1960s Norway. Each had taken place suspiciously close to a military base, and had since been irrefutably linked into international espionage activities. In more recent times, declassified Norwegian national defense records have revealed that the woman's movements throughout Europe seemed to mirror top-secret tests of the new Penguin missile, a medium-ranged, guided anti-ship missile that was set to be the bane of the Soviet Navy should the Cold War suddenly turn hot. This has been supposedly backed up by the eyewitness's testimony of the Norwegian fisherman, who has since claimed that he recognized composite sketches of the woman, having seen her while observing military exercises around the Norwegian city of Stavanger. However, after 35 long years of half-truths and dead ends, a witness finally came forward with perhaps the most significant piece of information to date. A resident of the city of Bergen came forward in 2005 after seeing one of the composite sketches put together in the initial aftermath of the charred body's discovery. He claimed that the drawing of the woman's face was uncannily similar to that of a woman that he had seen around 5 days before the scorched body was found. He had been hiking on another one of the mountains that surrounded Bergen called Fløyen, when he noticed a person in rather unusual attire. Instead of the standard warm and waterproof outdoor wear as is normally worn by hill hikers, he saw a woman dressed in light, casual clothing. According to the man's testimony, she seemed resigned, even melancholy, and for a moment seemed as if though she might say something to him, although she never did. It was then that the man noticed that the woman was being followed by 2 men wearing warm, heavy coats that had a distinctly foreign look to them. When pushed as to what exactly he meant by this, the man claimed they had very dark hair and eyes and were engaged in an intense conversation that they immediately ceased once they detected his presence further up the trail. The man also claimed he had gone to the police once the national inquiry had been launched to report the encounter, but was visited by high-ranking Norwegian security officers who had told him to forget about what he'd seen. Obviously, the man's account gives a large amount of credence to the idea that there was some kind of cover-up over the Isdale woman's death, especially when coupled with the overwhelming evidence that she was in fact murdered and had not actually taken her own life. There are many unanswered questions regarding the Isdale woman, and as the years go by, it seems less and less likely that we will ever have the answers to them. But what seems abundantly clear is that she didn't die of her own volition. More often than not, those that take their own lives leave a note of some description explaining why they did so, or at least as a means to say the last goodbyes to those who are dear to them. It is invariably a solitary act. They do not carry spare clothes with them, they do not scrub their belongings of identifiers, and they most certainly do not set themselves on fire whilst incapacitated. We can safely conclude that the Isdale woman was murdered in some way, and what was becoming increasingly clear is that someone, or some collection of individuals, has done everything in their power to bury the investigation, as well as her true identity. In 2004, in the sleepy Chicago suburb of Aurora, Illinois, Amy Pitson would give birth to her firstborn son. After some deliberation, she and her husband James would name the boy Timothy. The first 6 years of the boy's life were happy and uneventful, and we have every reason to believe that he was loved and well looked after by his two young parents. He had an extensive collection of relatives that he visited regularly, who cared for the boy just as much as his own parents did. But Timothy and his family were headed towards a tragedy that would confound and puzzle all that became familiar with it, a mystery that would remain unsolved even to this day. On the morning of May 11, 2011, James Pitson woke up, made breakfast for himself and his son, and then drove the boy to his kindergarten class over at Greenman Elementary School on West Galena Boulevard before he headed to work. But for some reason, a short while later, just after 8 a.m., Amy Pitson arrived at the school, telling a member of the teaching staff that there was a family emergency and that she needed to take Timothy out of the school for the day. Timothy's kindergarten teacher naturally obliged his mother, letting the young boy out of class to accompany her wherever she was headed, after wishing her the best with whatever emergency she was dealing with. However, instead of dealing with this apparent family emergency, Amy Pitson's whereabouts are unknown until around 10 a.m. that same morning, when she arrived at a vehicle repair shop in Aurora. A friendly employee of the shop then drove Pitson and her son over to the nearby Brookfield Zoo, where the pair then spent the remainder of the morning and the early afternoon relaxing and exploring the various animal exhibits that were on display there. At around 3 p.m., Amy and her son arrived back at the vehicle repair shop, collecting her car before driving over to the Key Lime Cove Resort in the small town of Gurnee, over in Lake County, which is known for its large water park, as well as being a subsidiary of Six Flags. After taking Timothy around the water park, Amy and her son spent the night at the resort, leaving early the next morning before driving over state lines to Wisconsin. Here they checked into the Kalahari Resort in the Wisconsin Dells at around 10 a.m., both being recorded on CCTV cameras. But since then, neither hide nor hair of Timothy Pitson had been seen anywhere. For all intents and purposes, the young man had vanished into thin air. Around lunchtime the following day, on May 13th, Amy Pitson made a series of phone calls to some of her relatives, including her brother-in-law and her mother. She assured them that they were not to worry, how she and Timothy were both safe and well, and that neither of them were in any danger. These relatives would later confirm that Timothy was indeed present with his mother at the time of these calls, since he could be heard in the background complaining that he was hungry. In the investigation that followed, cell phone records showed that the calls were made from an area close to Sterling in Vernon County, Wisconsin, and that the pair were apparently on the move again via Route 40. Yet contrary to what one might expect, Amy Pitson did not contact her husband, the one person you might assume that she would call to inform of her and her son's whereabouts. James had been frantic with worry ever since the evening of May 11th, when he had returned home to find the house empty, and have subsequently heard the news that his wife had taken Timothy out of school. On the evening of May 13th, Amy Pitson was recorded on the security cameras of a Winnebago Family Dollar store. She was alone when she purchased a notebook, some stationery, and some envelopes. She was still all on her own when she was sighted in a branch of Sullivan's Food, also in Winnebago, Wisconsin, where she apparently visited the pharmacy counter before swiftly leaving. She was not spotted again until just past 11 that night, when she had apparently returned to Illinois, checking into a room, the Rockford Inn in the city of Rockford. The following day, in the early afternoon of May 14th, a member of the housekeeping staff at the inn visited the room that Amy Pitson was staying in, with the intention of cleaning the room. There was no Do Not Disturb sign present on the door handle, and when the housekeeper knocked, there was no reply from inside the room. So against her better judgment, she unlocked the room and walked inside. There, to her absolute horror, she found Amy Pitson lying face up on sheets that were soaked with blood. Pitson had taken an overdose of powerful antihistamines before slashing her own wrists. She had also apparently left a note on a nearby dresser, stating that she was well and truly sorry for the mess that she had caused, but that Timothy would never be found. However, the note was quick to reassure those that read it that Timothy was in fact safe, with people who would care for him, but that it would be pointless to look for him since his new guardians had hidden him away and would never give him up. After being called, police quickly arrived on the scene to shut off the hotel room for forensic examination. They located the knife that Amy Pitson had taken her own life with and, upon close inspection of her car, found traces of what appeared to be an alarming amount of her son's blood. Yet upon analysis, only Amy's blood was found to be on the knife found at the scene. To the relief of investigators, close relatives of the Pitsons revealed that in the run-up to Timothy's disappearance, he had suffered a rather large nosebleed in the car, and this is why so many trace particles could be found inside the vehicle. Amy Pitson's cell phone was nowhere to be found at the scene of her death, but it was later found in a grassy verge on the edge of Route 78, evidently tossed out the window of her moving vehicle as she returned to Illinois. But analysis of her cell records shed no further light on what she had done nor why she had done it, and there were no clues regarding her son's whereabouts to be found. Furthermore, the analysis of Amy's vehicle revealed that at some point she had been parked in a grassy area. There were traces of clay embedded in the vehicle's tires, which investigators surmised had come from a place with a stream or river nearby. Thus, it is highly possible that Amy had driven into a rural area, possibly off-road, in order to hand Timothy over to his new keepers. Pitson has since made it abundantly clear that he believes his son is still very much alive. In August of 2018, the since-canceled law enforcement TV show Live PD showed their viewers some digitally generated age progression images showing what Timothy might look like at age 13. The guest on that episode of the show was Angeline Hartman of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, who urged members of the public to come forward with any and all information that may help police locate Timothy. But none of the calls that were made as a result came to anything at all. However, less than a year later, calls were made to police in northern Kentucky that brought a phenomenal amount of hope to those who wished for Timothy's return, but also revealed an unfathomable mystery and an unimaginable evil. On the 3rd of April 2019, citizens in the city of Newport called local police to inform them that a teenage boy was wandering in nearby streets, apparently in a daze, after having run across a bridge on the Ohio River. Police soon located the young man, who was shaken, distraught, and exhausted, and who required a great deal of consoling before he could even bring himself to speak. Police asked the teenager for his name, and his reply shook them to their core. "Timothy," he stammered. "Timothy Pitson." The boy was rushed to Louisville, Kentucky's largest city, where he was interviewed by detectives regarding his apparent disappearance 8 years previously. He said he couldn't remember a thing, that the most he could recall was escaping a house in neighboring Ohio before running across the river bridge. But DNA tests would reveal something that was devastatingly disappointing to James Pitson, who was indescribably overjoyed at the sudden breakthrough in the case. The boy was not Timothy Pitson. The entire story was an intricate lie fabricated by then 23-year-old Brian Michael Rennie. Rennie had been released from Belmont Correctional Institution in Ohio just shy of a month prior to his terrible claims. He had served just 14 months on charges of burglary and vandalism, resulting from acts committed in Medina County. Sergeant Bill Rowley, a spokesman for Aurora Police, later released a statement saying that, "Although we are disappointed that this turned out to be a hoax, we remain diligent in our search for Timothy, as our missing persons case remains unsolved." One cannot possibly imagine what would have possessed Brian Michael Rennie to tell such a heinous and evil lie. It is possible that he had seen an episode of Live PD or somehow heard of Timothy's disappearance whilst incarcerated and wished to hit back at a world that he viewed with what must have been a remarkable degree of contempt. But either way, Timothy Pitson remains missing to this day, and there have been no sightings of the boy since the day he suddenly disappeared at the hands of his mother. However, no bodies have been found, not even a drop of blood that wasn't easily explainable. So, it is entirely possible that he is still out there, somewhere in the United States, just waiting to be found. On the 27th of January 1959, a group of 9 Soviet hikers set off for the Ural mountain range in central Russia on a hiking trip that was to celebrate the 21st Congress of the Soviet Communist Party. Each was an experienced grade 2 hiker with ski tour experience, and given that they were all enrolled at the Ural Polytechnic Institute, one of the Soviet Union's most distinguished centers of higher education, we can safely assume that they were a hardy, focused, and highly intelligent group. But between the 1st and 2nd of February, a mysterious and tragic event resulted in the death of all 9 hikers. Despite a recent investigation by the Russian government, whose spurious claims that it was a heroic event in which there was no panic at all, many still claim that there are deeper and more terrifying explanations for the deaths than a mere avalanche. And given the Russian government's penchant for Maskirovka, the doctrine of denial and deception, there was good reason to disbelieve their claims. Before the hikers departed for the Urals, the group leader, Igor Dyatlov, had promised to notify the head of their hiking club as soon as they had returned to civilization. They had planned to return by the 12th of February, but Dyatlov had been clear that no alarm should be raised if they happened to be a few days late. However, by the time the 20th of February had rolled around, there was still no word from the hiking group. Relatives began to demand that a search party be formed in order to confirm that their loved ones were indeed simply delayed and not in any danger. The Ural Polytechnic Institute rounded up as many volunteers as they could to form the first search party that would trace the supposed route of the Dyatlov group. But as time went on, they were quickly joined by military and law enforcement search parties as the operation became increasingly hazardous. It was the 26th of February when one of the search parties finally located the first sign of the Dyatlov group. On the eastern shoulder of the Hyolatsyako mountain, the group's damaged and abandoned tent was found. Known as the Hyolatsyako in the indigenous Mansi language, the name means Dead Mountain, a heavily ominous moniker given the fate of the Dyatlov group. The scene confounded the search party. Not only had the tent apparently been cut open from the inside, but almost all of the group's belongings were left behind, including their shoes. So we can safely assume that the Russian government's claim that there was no panic involved in the incident is a complete fallacy. Would a calm, well-organized group cut their only shelter to shreds and flee into deep snow in merely their socks or bare feet? No, absolutely not. Leading away from the tent were 9 sets of footprints, one for each member of the Dyatlov group. The frigid temperatures and deep snow meant that the trail was easily followed to the edge of some nearby woods just less than a mile away. Here the search party found signs that the group had attempted to make a small campfire to keep warm. But not far from the fire, under a large Siberian pine, the search party found the first 2 corpses of the missing hikers. Only they were not just shoeless, they were wearing nothing but their underwear. The branches of the tree they were lying under were broken up to 5 meters high, meaning that one of their number had attempted to climb it to either look for something or to try and escape someone or something. In the area between the pines and where the group were camped, the search party found 3 additional corpses, including that of the group's leader, Igor Dyatlov. These corpses were lying prone, as if they had been crawling back towards the area where their tent was pitched. The remaining 4 bodies of the Dyatlov group were found months later, under 4 meters of snow in a ravine less than 100 meters from the pine tree with broken branches. Curiously, one of their number was wearing trousers that had signs of being burned, either as kindling for the campfire that they had tried to make or for some other inexplicable reason. As a result of their relatives' demands, the Soviet justice system opened up a thorough legal investigation immediately after the first 5 corpses were found. Despite one of the hikers having a small crack in his skull, the medical examiner concluded that this was not a fatal wound and that each of the first 5 discovered had died of hypothermia. It was speculated that the medical examiners would come to similar conclusions regarding the remaining 4 bodies, but upon their discovery and analysis, the narrative shifted to something altogether more terrifying. Of the 4 bodies found in the forest ravine, 3 had injuries that medical examiners deemed to be fatal. One had suffered major skull damage, while another 2 had devastating chest fractures incurred by forces similar to that of a car crash. What's more, none of the bodies had any external wounds that are commonly associated with bone fractures, almost as if each of them had been subjected to an incredibly high level of pressure, such as from a large explosion. All 4 bodies had also suffered soft tissue damage, such as missing tongues, gouged out eyes, and sliced off lips. Some were even missing fragments of skull bone, or had their eyebrows cut off by something razor sharp. A forensic expert concluded that these soft tissue injuries were due to the fact that the bodies had been found in a stream at the bottom of a forest ravine, but as you can imagine, this has been disputed by many. Not to mention the bizarre idea that the 4 people would have chosen to take shelter in a stream, which they would have known would only exacerbate effects of hypothermia. In the initial aftermath of the investigation, there was wild speculation that the group had been attacked by the local indigenous Mansi people. The Mansi people are reindeer herders that have inhabited the Ural Mountains for thousands of years and are said to be very defensive of their sacred lands, having a long memory of the Russian incursions into their lands which resulted in the persecution of their people. A handful of Mansi tribesmen were rounded up and interrogated by Russian law enforcement officials, and to this day the tribe attests that they were flat-out accused of attacking and murdered the group for encroaching upon their lands. But eventually the accusations were dropped, as there were no signs of an obvious hand-to-hand struggle around any of the bodies. These are 2 points of issue that have been the cause of much curiosity over the years, neither of which have ever been properly explained. The first is that of all the information released to the general public. Before the investigations were confined to top-secret archives, there was not a shred of information regarding the condition of any of the hikers' internal organs. The only details released were of the injuries to the outside of their bodies and their bones, not to the interior organs. If this is the case, what did the Soviets have to hide regarding their injuries? The second interesting piece of information is the fact that a high amount of radiation was found on one of the hikers' clothing. Despite the fact that this is mentioned a number of times in the subsequent investigative report, the Russian government has consistently stayed silent on it, refusing to comment or investigate why this was the case. One of the only accounts relating to this facet of the case comes from a man named Yuri Kuntsevich, who later became the head of the Dyatlov Foundation, whose goal is to discover the truth behind the incident, and he attended 5 of the hikers' funerals. He recalled that their skin had a deep brown tan. In addition to this, the remains of one of the hikers were exhumed in April of 2018 after the request of journalists from a Russian newspaper. The body's DNA was analyzed, and the results were a complete and utter shock to those involved. They revealed that the DNA bore absolutely no resemblance to any of the hikers' living relatives, so much so that the journalists speculated that another person had assumed the hiker's identity. Another source worth consulting regarding the Dyatlov incident is a book published in 1990 called The Price of State Secrets is 9 Lives, published during a time when the Soviet Union was essentially falling apart and that many of the country's old secrets were coming to light. The work focused on the idea that a secret Soviet weapon experiment was to blame for the deaths of the hikers. This would certainly explain the high amount of radiation that could be found on one of the dead hikers' clothing. There were many individuals who had previously remained silent regarding their involvement in the incident who came forward with new and startling information. One of them was an ex-police officer who led the official inquest back in 1959, who admitted that the investigative team had absolutely no rational explanation for the incident. He also stated, after, his team reported that they had seen flying spheres. He then received direct orders from high-ranking regional officials to retract the claim and forget what he'd seen that night. The flying spheres point is also backed up by another group of hikers who were hiking around 30 miles south of the Kyolet-Syoko mountain on the night of the incident. They reported that they had seen strange orange spheres in the sky to the north of the night in question. Similarly strange spherical shapes have been witnessed in the nearby town of Ivdel during February and March of 1959 by a variety of other witnesses, including the official Soviet Meteorology Service, as well as the Soviet military. Naturally, both were told not to report on what they'd seen by high-ranking members of the political apparatus, and only came forward in the 90s when it was safe to do so. As was previously stated, the Russian government's official explanation for the incident is an avalanche, but there is a great deal of evidence that contradicts this theory. One such piece of evidence is the fact that the location of the incident did not show any signs of an avalanche having ever taken place. An avalanche would have most certainly left very distinct patterns in the area, not to mention how it would have spread debris around. The bodies found within the first month of the event were covered with a very shallow layer of snow. If there actually was an avalanche of sufficient strength to sweep away the second party, these bodies would have been swept away as well. This would have caused much more grievous injuries in the process and would have also caused severe damage in the nearby tree line. What's more, an analysis of the terrain and slope showed that even if there could have been an avalanche, its path would have actually avoided the hiker's campsite. Since 1959, there have been over 100 expeditions to the region, and not a single one of them ever reported conditions that might create an avalanche. A study of the area using modern terrain-focused geographical techniques showed that the location made it extremely unlikely for an avalanche to be able to occur. The only dangerous conditions were observed in April and May when the snowfalls of winter were melting. During February, when the incident occurred, there were no such conditions. Given the information available to us, we can safely conclude that the official explanation does not simply add up. Not only is it highly unlikely that an avalanche ever occurred, but there are far too many strange and terrifying pieces of information that have come to light for us to believe anything other than whatever happened that night would be far too horrifying for the general public to comprehend. The first set of bodies were not at all difficult to find, and it seems obvious that given the close proximity of the final 4 bodies to the original campsite, they would have been found eventually, especially when the snow begins to thaw towards the late spring and summer. So why exactly did the Soviet military insist on getting involved in the search? The answer is obvious. They knew well what was going on around Kholet Syokol, and were simply there to keep their secrets from ever coming out. It's just a huge shame, as was referenced in the title of the Anatoly Guchkin book, published in 1990, that the price of the Soviet secrets were worth human lives. Jonathan Luna was born on October 21, 1965 in New York City, son to a Filipino father and an African-American mother, and spent his formative years in the Patterson housing project near Yankee Stadium in the South Bronx. John made his parents as proud as can be, not only being the first in his family to go to college, but receiving a first-class undergraduate degree in law from Fordham University. He later studied at the University of North Carolina School of Law, where he was roommates with Reggie Shufford, who would later go on to be executive director of the ACLU of Pennsylvania. During the 90s, Luna worked at Arnold & Porter in Washington, D.C., as well as the Federal Trade Commission, serving as a prosecutor in the Brooklyn borough of New York City before moving to Baltimore, Maryland to become an assistant United States attorney. Luna married obstetrician Angela Hopkins on August 29, 1993, and together they had 2 children. They were the modern nuclear family, leading joy-filled lives for many years. That was until tragedy struck, a tragedy that would raise many questions in the years to come. While Jonathan was employed as an assistant United States attorney in Elk Ridge, Baltimore, his focus was on the highly noble task of convicting violent predators for their heinous crimes that they perpetrated. It was on the morning of the 4th of December 2003 that Jonathan left his home and headed to the office. The case he was involved with at the time revolved around 2 individuals who were suspected of dealing heroin out of their record label studios, known almost comically as Stash House Records. One of these men also happened to be facing a charge for homicide. Jonathan worked all day and late into the evening on a plea deal that was about to be offered to one of the supposed drug dealers, finally calling one of his colleagues around 9 that night to inform them that he was only just about to head back home. Yet according to the office's time clock, Jonathan didn't actually leave until around 20 minutes to midnight, and although he required prescription glasses to drive, he left them behind at the office. Information taken from CCTV cameras and Luna's credit card records indicate that He drove to the state of Delaware at around 1 in the morning, where he withdrew $200 from an ATM machine. He then drove through New Jersey and into Pennsylvania, where his credit card was used once again to withdraw cash from a bank machine. Luna's Easy Pass had been recorded as being used, but for some reason, after entering Delaware, he started to purchase toll tickets. The following morning, at around 5:30, an employee of Senseneg & Weaver, a well drilling company in Denver, Pennsylvania, spotted the vehicle parked up behind the main building. He saw that blood had been smeared over the door and front fender, as well as there being a puddle of blood on the back seat. There was blood-stained cash all around the vehicle's interior. The drilling worker quickly called the police, and after a brief search of the area, Jonathan's dead body was found in a nearby creek. He had suffered more than 30 stab wounds and inflicted with his own penknife, having received knife wounds to his throat and genitals. Yet the actual cause of death was drowning from having fallen into the creek itself. Due to the puddle of blood in the back seat of the vehicle, investigators deduced that Luna had sustained the majority of his wounds while seated there. Police also found unidentified fingerprints in the blood, including unidentified blood which indicated that not only was Luna not alone back there, but that he had actually fought back against his assailant before succumbing to his wounds. This is where the case gets weird. Very weird. At first, the death was ruled an obvious homicide, one in which whoever had attacked Jonathan had initially been repelled by the man's own knife, before wresting it from him and using it to take his life. However, an FBI agent ordered the pathologist in charge of the post-mortem to chance his verdict to him ending his own life, despite the fact that Luna had wounds to his back that he could not possibly have inflicted on himself. Then a series of bizarre rumors involving Luna began to circulate around the media, some which asserting that he was involved in the embezzlement of $36,000. A reporter from the Baltimore Sun received an anonymous tip that Luna was also terrified of being found that he had ended his own life, though the source would provide absolutely no evidence of this. But there was also ample evidence that Luna was building a strong case against a ring of violent predators, some of which were employed at high levels of the federal government. It is possible that he was assassinated as a result of this very investigation. And why in the world would an FBI agent have such an obvious example of murder ruled as him ending his own life? We may never know just why such a good man was murdered in such a violent fashion, but what's clear is that no one has ever been convicted or even arrested for his involvement in that death. And given that there must have been ample forensic evidence, this makes for some very disturbing implications indeed. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/Let'sReadOfficial, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends, and remember, Cheetos, Fritos, and Doritos.